So first of all, I would like to do a very brief acknowledgement to country. So I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I'm hosting and recording this webinar on today. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands in which you are all joining from. I acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in the webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples, their ongoing cultures and connections to the land, water and communities. Now, you all know our topic today is feeding bees. So I'm going to shift the focus over to Kevin, who may have a bit more of a run sheet on how we are going to connect everybody with the information from Madlen and other bits and pieces. So over you go, Kevin.
Okay, welcome everyone. That's what I want to say. I just think this is amazing that we can do this, thinking that we're from different states, different locations, varying abilities and interests. I do want to give a couple of apologies firstly, and that's Alicia Holmes has been given a mammoth task to do, and it has to be done before Monday. So she's not with us today, but still available if you have or need any questions or working on Canvas. Well, available after Monday. Otherwise, talk to Kelly or Bianca and Kelly. What else? Where do I go? Oh, it's good to see a couple of trainees on board. Welcome, guys. I'm just going to keep referring to you because I know that you could start talking to one another and we can see your level of interest, okay? Now, we also want to welcome Madlen from, well, she's at WA at the moment, and she's our newly appointed, in big capital letters, Honeybee Industry Development Officer. Hooray! And not only does Madlen know her stuff from my understanding, she's good fun too. Has a great sense of humor and will be able to answer our questions, which is what we're here for. Okay, so what we're going to do, you enjoying yourself there, Alan? Where we're going to go with this is we're going to get Madlen to do a bit of a talk to us. Yeah, is that all right with you, Madlen? A bit of a presentation. And then we may, even after that, take questions, answers with Madlen for a time. Kelly's going to do a bit of input from the perspective of trapping and storing pollen, which is part of one of the courses that many of you will have completed or are going to complete. It's an interesting area. What else? Then it'd be really good if we can talk about how people feed, do they feed, what do they use, and enter into the area as well of things like syrup versus fondant and patties versus dry feeding, etc. Okay, so this is a pretty fully orbed, if you will, many facets. I have a son who's a jeweler, so I like to talk in facets that we can deal with, okay? I also want to say hi to Vern because I'm assuming that he's behind the wheel, okay? So, yeah, let's go for it. And just before I do, if in case Madlen doesn't, I would direct everybody to the fact that there is a YouTube of Madlen's presentation at the 2019 Appomondia Conference. So do that as a bit of follow-up. Don't go there now because we've got Madlen live. Thank you, Madlen.
All right, thanks, Kevin. And hi, everyone. So my background is in honeybee research, and over the last few years, I've spent most of my time looking at different aspects of honeybee nutrition. And I think one of the most important things about nutrition is knowing what the bees need when, and what do they need in terms of different times of the season, and whether they are expanding, are they growing brood, or are you raising queens, and so on. And what I became interested in looking at is also specifically how do honeybees forage, because it all is part of the story. And what I wanted to know is how our decisions that we make as beekeepers where we place our colonies. So if we shift them to different sites where we have different floral sources available, how does that affect the health of the bees? And how does it affect how honeybees might forage differently? So what I've done is I've set up colonies with different food sources. And what I was comparing, one was canola, and another one that one is a bit of an interesting one because during our winter time, so around this time of the year and going into July, August, in WA, that's where I was doing my experiments, beekeepers have a choice of putting their colonies onto canola or onto the coast. And the coast is generally a mixture of different native species. But for this season, for some reason, I think there must have not been much flowering towards the end of winter. And interesting enough, the bees actually went onto farmland and collected clover. So that's what I had for my experiments, because that was what was happening. So I was comparing clover, canola, and eucalypts, our Jarrah, and a Columbia species, which we call our red gum, but it's not the red gum that you have on the eastern coast. So those were the 4 different species I looked at. And then coming out of winter, if you are into or doing bee pollination, beekeepers can move their hives onto avocado. So we've got quite a lot of avocado crops popping up in WA, and we've got one of the bigger orchards in WA. So I wanted to know if it makes a difference in terms of colony strength if beekeepers choose the coast versus canola. And so I was measuring, one of the things I was looking at was bird patterns and how strong the colonies grew. And what I found is that interestingly for the clover, the bees actually didn't expand as much. And for particularly eucalypt, so for Jarrah and for clover, they expanded further, and the colonies were just a little bit stronger. But it's in terms of how healthy the colonies were, I was looking at how well the colonies were raising young larvae and what happens to the nutrition of the bees when they hatch. Because one way we can assess the health of a bee is by looking at, common measure is longevity. So how long do the bees live? And if you have longer lived bees, then they would go and collect more nectar and so on, or more pollen. And also, you can also look at the nutritional composition. So you can look at things like the protein content of bees. You can look at individual amino acids, fatty acids, and so on. And honeybees are actually very good at regulating their nutrition. So what that means is that depending, I was comparing the different floral sources, but in the end, I did not find a difference in their body composition. So with Jarrah, for example, and that is true for a lot of our eucalypts, they tend to be low in one of the essential amino acids that bees need, and that's isoleucine. And what I wanted to know is if a pollen, for example, is deficient in a particular amino acid that the bees have to get from the diet, so they cannot obtain that from, or cannot produce it themselves, would we see a deficiency in the bees? And the answer with the pollens I was comparing is actually no. So the bees, if the levels are slightly below their requirements, they can, to some extent, make up for deficiencies by consuming more of the food source. So it's kind of similar to humans, I guess, in a way. So if we have a food source that's a little bit deficient in something, if we eat more of it, then we might be able to make up for it. Now, in some pollens that are completely deficient, that would, of course, not be possible if it's an essential nutrient that they need. But with bees, they also have a tendency to regulate it in a different way. So if nutrition is not optimal, then they can also they produce smaller bees. So the bees that are hatching, they are lower in weight. And sometimes you can even physically see that they somewhat look a little bit smaller, but that might be a little bit hard to tell. And what we know is that honeybees that are born on a lower body weight, they tend to live shorter lives as well. So that was a few things that I looked at. In terms of foraging behavior, for example, what I wanted to know is if bees have different nutritional stores, so if they are of different quality, would they adjust their foraging behavior to go out and, for example, collect different nectar, different pollen, if to make up for their diet? And that one is an interesting one because for time being, we know that honeybees are attracted to different floral sources. So they are attracted, for example, to pollens that are high in fat content, and there's certain plant compounds that attract bees or not attract bees. And with avocados, the nectar actually tends to be high in a mineral, in potassium, and that actually makes the nectar less attractive to bees. So there are different minerals, different fatty acids that attract or not attract bees. And there's more and more research showing that honeybees, to some degree, can actually detect some nutritional compounds in terms of, for example, amino acids in nectar, or various things like in pollen as well. So while there's still a bit of a knowledge gap in terms of what the exact fat requirements, for example, are in honeybees, or fatty acids, there's some which are essential, like linoleic and linolenic fatty acid, but some of the requirements for fats and also for minerals are still not quite understood at this point. So in terms of how honeybees forage at, this case, an avocado orchard, what was interesting is that the bees, they tended to forage for about three different major pollens at the orchard. And in that case, the orchard was actually, I think, a little bit of heaven for the bees compared to what's happening in other orchards, specifically in the States where you have almonds and nothing else. At that orchard, they actually had a diversity of other weeds, and there was even a cherry tree flowering in the middle of the orchard. So in that sense, the bees were actually quite lucky. But it was interesting to see that a lot of bees collected pollen from weeds and from elsewhere. So that could be something that could be potentially very crucial for honeybees to have that pollen source. But it also really depends on what type of orchard we're talking about, because every orchard is different and the diversity would be different. And also how the crop is actually pollinated, because in the case of avocados, for example, it is the nectar collectors that do the pollinating. And the reason for that is because avocados have a very unique flowering cycle of male and female flowers. So the nectar collectors, they still get pollen, avocado pollen on their body, and would visit male and female flowers at the same time, whereas the pollen collectors only go to the male flowers and collect the pollen. So not sure if that makes sense, but you can ask me questions about it if afterwards. And so yeah, it's a matter. So at the case of avocados, beekeepers actually set up their colonies to get the bees to collect more nectar instead of focusing on pollen. Now, most other crops it's the pollen collectors that that do the pollination. But yeah, with the nectar collectors, they tended to actually forage on a much broader range of flowers. So they would still go to avocado as well, but you would have bees that go to avocado and other things during one foraging trip, or would also go and visit a larger diversity than the pollen collectors, for example. So are there any questions?
Hi, Madlen. I've got a question about ash in beef, in nectar and pollen. Something that was written in one of Doug's books said that ash was toxic to bees, but it didn't go into details.
Yeah. So with ash, so ash is, if you analyze ash content, is usually a estimate for mineral content. See, what they do is, for example, with pollen, they would essentially heat the pollen, burn it, and what's left is the ash content. So it still has some other contaminants in it, but it would be an estimate of how much minerals are in nectar or in pollen, for example. So not sure if that's what you mean.
I'll have a look for the reference.
Yes.
It's probably easier. Maybe I'll send you an email later.
Yes, you can do that. Yeah, that sounds good.
I think it was referenced in the Fat Bee Skinny Bees.
Yeah.
Because I was reading that last night thinking, what specifically?
As you do.
It is 05 print, so Madlen. A new one. But yeah, I guess there might not have been much science behind the reasoning in those comments at the time, perhaps. But it was something I was questioning too, Corinne.
Yeah, so I want Tracy and Kelly Lees from to follow on that. Kelly on 0438.
Is it because, is there a toxic level of minerals?
Yes, so if some mineral content gets too high, it can be toxic to bees, yeah.
I've got another question. I don't want to hog this, but vitamin B for bees. Someone who is making up a bee feed recipe was asking me if I knew anything about it, and I thought, well, I might as well ask while I've got someone who's an expert on nutrition. Do you know if bees need extra vitamin B added, or if they benefit from it being added to pollen patties or dry pollen mix?
I mean, bees do have a need for vitamins. In terms of whether vitamin B specifically would help bee, I would have to follow up on that one. But yeah, I mean, there have been studies where people have added vitamins and it didn't seem to make much of a difference. So I think the need for vitamins is maybe not as crucial at higher levels, because with vitamins they can, if vitamin levels get too high, they can just excrete it. So that doesn't, I guess, affect bees as much. But
so if you added too much vitamin B, it wouldn't be toxic.
I wouldn't.
How much have you added, Corinne?
I don't know. It's not me who makes the recipe, Andrew. He's pretty good at things. I just wondered if there was a toxic level to be safe.
Well, yes. I've had it on a drip, so.
Yes, I haven't experimented with it myself. But yeah.
Okay. Can I ask a question that's kind of way out there, but it's just from hearing people and the things that they give their bees, you know what I mean, like essential oils and things like that, Madlen.
Yes.
Can you comment on that, thanks, diplomatically?
Yes, I think we have some very creative beekeepers. And I think it is good to experiment, because that's how you find things out.
Thank you for that scientific perspective.
But it is also interesting, especially with different flowers, for example, because you can have certain sugars that are, for example, toxic to bees.
Yeah.
So I think whenever you make up or try different things, I think you have to also be aware of what they might be made out of, especially if it's not any pollens. I mean, pollens can be deficient in certain things, but when it comes to using flowers, I think you need to do a little bit more research in terms of if it contains any toxic substances or is maybe too high in mineral contents, for example.
I think Paul had a question or comment.
No, yeah, just a comment, Kevin. I just said, as the last thing was being said by Madlen, that that is the fantastic thing about beekeepers. They are willing to try anything just to try and give them that bit of an edge. If something works, it's great. If it doesn't work, well, it's back to the drawing board.
Yeah. If it doesn't work, I split another colony.
Yeah, something like that.
Any other questions, please?
Yeah, I had a question, but could you have to mute first?
Okay. I'm muting so that Kelly can talk. I don't know how to do, I can't do this to myself.
So, Madlen, I just wanted to clarify something.
Yeah.
Sorry, because we're in the same room, it's reverberating. Am I right in saying that you said when you studied the bees with the differing pollen sources that there wasn't any difference in their body composition, but that their size differed? So the size was what was impacting on their longevity, not their body composition? Did I understand you correctly?
So size is having an effect on how long bees live. In my case, there was a difference in size from, so I had the bees on one side where I was building them up initially because the colonies were made up from bee packages, and then I was feeding them the different pollen sources. Then I shifted them onto avocado, and the difference in body size was between the locations, but not between the treatments. So in my case, they had enough nutrition from all the 4 pollen sources that I was comparing to get enough nutrition, and there was no difference in body size. Now, at first I thought, oh, so why is there difference in body size between locations? And in my case, I've actually had pollen traps on all of the colonies as well. So technically, they were limited in what they could bring in, and so somehow, well, I thought the feed would make a difference, but looking at it across locations, it doesn't seem to be the case. But what happens with bees is that also the ratio of larvae to how many nurse bees you have can affect how well the larvae gets fed. So if you have a lot of nurse bees looking after a smaller patch of brood, then they get fed much better, I guess, compared to if you have lots of brood and only a few nurse bees to look after them. And that can make a difference in how big the bees grow. So initially, when I was making up the colonies from packages, there would have been a smaller ratio of nurse bees because the bees divide the tasks amongst them. So some become foragers, some become nurse bees, and some. So there was I believe that there was a smaller ratio between how many nurses could look after larvae, and that's why they were smaller in body weight.
I've got a question to follow on from Kelly's. Madlen, I thought that physical size of bees was more related to the size, the actual physical size of cells, because the bees have an exoskeleton. It's actually what goes in to the bees that determines their body protein content and that sort of thing. But because they've got the exoskeleton grows to a certain size. So if you've got a case where you've got really old comb that's got extremely thick walls due to a lot of larval casings and propolis build up, you're going to get physically smaller bees.
I think there is something to that, because especially if you also have a workers laying eggs and you get male brood, and they lay it into worker cells, you get much smaller drones. And so I think that that could be right, that you do get smaller bees depending on the size of the cells as well.
Yeah, because
when I say when I'm referring to smaller bees, I also talk about their weight. So the way we look at it is we don't measure their body size in terms of length or width. It's looking at it in terms of weight. So maybe that's not quite the right terminology.
Yeah, because that's the whole idea of putting foundation in the hives so that the bees have actually got the potential of growing to their biggest size that they're genetically capable of. Yes. Because they aren't limited by, the cell size has to be the right size, but as time goes by and the larval casings and propolis builds up, the actual physical size of the bees does decrease.
Yes, thanks for that, Paul. I have a question, because Madlen, you said what you were studying or what's important. I mean, one of the important things is the when and what to feed. And given that over recent times, which was a long time, we've had drought, bushfire, and the like. Could you shed some light on that for what should be being considered feed-wise? And can I tack another one on there about there's a lot of supplements out there, and some do and some don't have pollen in them. Comments, thanks.
Yes, I might have to start writing a list of all the questions at once. so
feel free.
Remind me if I haven't talked about something. But yeah, in terms of when to feed what, I think it's important to keep in mind what the end goal is. So whether you're trying to stimulate bees or just keep them alive as such. Because, for example, in terms of sugar feeding, if you feed bees with dry sugar under the lid, for example, that would give the bees a source of carbohydrates, but it wouldn't necessarily stimulate them to rear brood or stimulate them to do much else foraging wise. So if you do want to stimulate them, on the other hand, you would want to use a 1-to-1 sugar syrup concentration. And you can use 2-to-1, which is a thicker syrup, and that would also stimulate the bees less than if you use a thinner sugar syrup. In terms of pollen supplements, or protein supplements, that is an interesting topic, because so in the past, pollen has been added to supplements to make it more attractive to bees, because there's two problems. One is the food source needs to be attractive to the bees, and the other one is it also needs to be digestible. So even if you have a like, for example, for brood rearing, you ideally need bees need protein above around 25% is ideal. But if, let's say, you have a supplement that has 40% protein, but the bees can't actually physically digest it or take it up, it won't be any good to the bees either. And too high protein can actually have a negative effect on the bees as well. But in terms of commercial supplements, there's a lot of supplements that have been created and become available in the market over the years. And I think in terms of a solution to keep bees alive, that's what we need. In terms of being able to feed supplements for a long period of time, we still have the problem that bees cannot sustain bees for a long period on supplements.
It's 3 generations or something, isn't it? Is that?
Yes, I believe it's something like 4 to 6 weeks, but the beekeepers will be able to to speak from their experience. So yeah, pollen in the end is still the best in terms of still works the best for breeding bees, but yeah, sometimes we can't get around it.
Thank you.
Did I answer all your questions?
Oh, you're pretty close, Madlen, but you'll be on site soon, so we'll set you up with a desk in here. Yeah.
So, Madlen, I want to ask you a question as well. Are all the chemical constituents of pollen been identified now, or are there things in pollen that we still don't know about? Because I'm just wondering about, you know, the reason why supplements aren't great long term. Are there elements in there that interact with each other that create the difference for bees?
So in terms of analyzing, you mean pollen, for analyzing pollen? Oops. Kelly, sorry, were you talking about nutrition analysis of pollen?
I'm just talking about, you know, have all the substances that make up pollen been identified from a chemical?
Yes, okay. In terms of the nutritional side of things, so the amino acids, fatty acids, minerals, and so on, that we can identify in pollen. And a lot of bee-collected pollen, especially in Australia, where we are ahead in terms of honeybee research compared to other countries, we have actually, we do have a large variety of pollens having been analyzed. The tricky thing for time being is still that we don't know about some of the nutrition requirements of the honeybees. So that's what's a little bit, I guess, limiting in terms of creating a perfect supplement.
Something else that comes into it is the chemical attractants that are produced by the plants that come through the pollen that has a major effect on the attractiveness to the bees to actually collect it.
Yes, that's right. And
Trying
one
to
of
get those chemical attractants, that is, yeah, I mean, they are so smaller content and such variety that, yeah, to actually get in and synthesize anything along those lines, yeah, the degree of difficulty must be fairly high.
Yes, I mean, one of the components that we know that is highly attractive to bees are certain fatty acids. And that's what I guess makes, canola, for example, has a large fatty acid content, which makes it attractive to honeybees. But yes, there's still, it's a very, very complex world understanding what attracts bees, what doesn't, and what exactly do they need.
Thanks, Madlen. That's why you're here, isn't it? You're going to create a whole new book and research and answer every single question there is about honeybee nutrition and supplemental feeding. God bless us.
I hope so anyway.
Yeah.
For eternity. Thank you.
Yes. And now I think we might, unless there's something pressing for Madlen, we'll get Kelly to do a bit of talk about trapping and storing pollen. And I just have to say, Rachel, you'll have to excuse me a moment. I'm getting car sick. Thanks, Kelly. I'll shut up.
All good, Kevin.
Look at old Damo, he's on the tractor.
To say about trapping and storing pollen. Madlen's already touched on the fact that obviously we all know pollen's critical for brood rearing. So if you're thinking about trapping pollen, you need to consider what kind of sources your bees are on and what kind of pollen banks they have in the hives. Remembering that when you're trapping pollen, you are reducing the fresh pollen that's coming into the hive, and bees definitely have a preference for consuming newer pollen as opposed to pollen that's been stored for a long period of time. So if you leave the trap on too long, you're actually what will happen is the brood area will start reducing. And if you leave it on sort of more than a week, you're looking at the queen stopping laying, and you will get that significant reduction in brood because the bees actually want that fresh pollen coming into the hive. So you do need to consider that when you decide if and when to trap pollen, and you also need to consider time of year as well. So you'd want significant pollen coming in the first place into the hive, and also considering what source you're on and time of year. You probably wouldn't want to be thinking about trapping pollen, you know, coming straight into spring, because you want that pollen coming into the hive to have that brood nest expanding. But yeah, I think that's probably in a nutshell.
Any questions or comments with regards to that bit of input?
Yeah, I've got a question.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie.
Hey, Kelly.
Yep.
Hive beetle on the coast here in Newcastle. Obviously, at times it's quite bad. How long do you leave your pollen traps on in relation to hive beetle blowing it?
If you're somewhere where they're really bad, I'd be thinking about emptying your trap every second day sort of maximum, because it is highly attractive to hive beetle and they will get into it. And obviously the longer it's outside the hive, it's also attracting moisture. Yeah, hive beetle are really into it. So I know some people, you know, empty it every 3-4 days, something like that, but I think in an area where there's a lot of hive beetle, I'd be keeping a very close eye on how frequently you trap it. But also you'd be gauging which hives you put that on, and obviously if you've got a colony that is really vigorously collecting pollen, I'd be checking it, yeah, every second day max.
Excellent, thank you.
I've got a question about pollen traps. I haven't actually seen any for sale around southeast Queensland in our bee supply stores. So which are the best and where are they available from?
Good question. We've got a few different sorts here at the college, and my advice to you would be don't buy them online. I've seen some ones online and the holes are actually too small, the bees can't fit through them. Pender's Beekeeping does have some that we've used. Look, yeah, shop around. I can't name a specific brand that is better than another, but certainly the Chinese ones that are online, that they're brown and yellow, they're terrible.
Back in the early to mid 1980s, Beeco in Warwick was making pollen traps, and I know that Don Keith out at Inglewood, he bought it was either 100 or 200 of these traps that he would use to collect pollen in the springtime out around Inglewood. What he would do is he would leave the pollen, the Beeco pollen traps had a flap that allowed bees to either go through and have pollen trapped off them, or you could close that and bees could go in untouched. So that meant to say that he could alternate, that with those traps you could alternate between the days that you were collecting pollen and the days that you weren't.
Yeah.
That made a big difference to keeping the hives of sufficient strength so they could keep on collecting honey.
Yeah, look, all the pollen traps that I've seen actually have that facility. So they have the ability to be open or closed depending on whether you're trapping or not. And if it doesn't have that, then probably it's fairly inconvenient to use.
And try Paul Marsh, Corinne. He got a stack ages ago, and I think even if you don't actually get your hands on one, get a template how to build them, and then that gives you something to do with all those tools you've got.
Yeah, you can get some good bottom watermarks as well. There's a new plus one that isn't too bad that you can. It doesn't have to go on plastic pipes. It's just a standard bottom water. It's a pollen trap baseboard, which is not too bad.
Anyone else got any questions?
Yeah, just on storing the pollen, what's your best suggestion on storing it?
Come do trap and store pollen as an elective, but in a nutshell, if it's just for your use, you don't have to dry it. You can just pop it in a jar, you can sieve the dust out and then put it in a jar and keep it in the fridge. If you're looking at selling it, you do have to either freeze dry it or dry it in a food dehydrator, because you have to reduce the water content because it can get moldy really easily. So yeah, food dehydrator, you want it less than 6% water. There's a crumble test you can do, but you just need to experiment with that. But yeah, freeze dry or dry, and then you keep it in the fridge or freezer, but you don't have to if it's freeze dried.
Any life line on that, lifespan?
You're meant to keep it out of strong light, and yeah, it does have a lifespan, but I'm not 100% sure. I think it depends on how you process it in the first place and then how you store it. So for best longevity, you should dry it and then store it in the fridge.
Don Keith had a chest freezer that he used to freeze that pollen that was collected. As soon as you start drying the pollen, you start to lose those chemical attractants that the bees need to actually get in and consume the pollen in quantities.
So my question was to Troy, just briefly in that relation too, was is your query about collecting that pollen for bee feed later when you need it, or was your query about collecting and storing pollen for human consumption? Because the differences are pretty severe, and the reasons why you would do one over the other would probably be a very big factor in the quality of the pollen. There's a bit in Doug's Fat Bee, Skinny Bees about -15 degrees freezing, and the quality drop in the time. I can't remember the time, but yeah, if you're feeding it back to bees, I don't know if that conversation, Kelly, the answer you gave, I don't know if you're feeding it back to bees, if that's the best option.
Yeah, no,
but it probably is for feeding it to people. Yeah. So it depends. I think Paul's comment was about feeding it back to bees taking it from a good time to using it later on. But there's definitely a questionable amount of time there about when it would be. Madlen, do you know?
I think it is about a year. And after that, you really see a difference in the nutritional quality of the pollen.
And airtight storage and all that sort of factor, pretty important. And once it starts going moldy, hive people are more happy with it. Okay, so just want, not that I've had any experience with that. Look at your face, Corinne, I'm in trouble here. Anyway, okay, so thank you. What I would like is to throw it across to other folk. And how are you, if you have chosen to feed bees, all right, and it is a choice and it is a management consideration, okay? I never talk about with the idea of farm lot feeding, okay? So don't anyone get that idea that it's just, woohoo, I've got a bag of pollen, I'm gonna hang it from a tree, poke holes in it and just leave it there. Okay, so I just want to be clear on that. But some people here would feed, some would not. For those who do feed your bees, could you tell us the way you do it? Such things as patties, or even if it's sugar, do you make fondants, or do you dry feed, syrup feed? Let's hear from you guys, thanks.
I just sprinkled the pollen on the middle 4 or 5 frames on my hives.
Okay, thank you, Terry.
It's about a cup for each hive. I've got 8 frame hives, and just the centre, I just sprinkled it over the brood box in the centre few frames.
And what kind of frequency?
It's custom bee feed, it's called. I've only put 1 cup out, but otherwise I'm just doing 2-to-1 sugar syrup as far as feeding as well.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
Can I
Yeah,
just ask what the how often you would feed?
Hmm.
Like, is it every week, every second week, every?
I've only given mine one cup so far, each hive. But the syrup, they've been taking about 3 kilos each day. I don't know if that's too much or it's not enough, but I've been told if they're taking it, then they need it. So,
Madlen, you've gone quiet.
At the same time, I was thinking because if honeybees are being fed, I'm guessing you said sugar syrup.
But that's a 2 to 1,
Yeah.
isn't it, Terry?
yeah, 2 to 1.
Because the bees could also be storing it in the hive. So I don't know if you've been checking on whether they've been eating it all, or are they storing some of it, or?
I haven't checked mine for about 2 weeks now, and they're, yeah, as I said, the aim of it is to make sure they don't starve, obviously, when they hit spring. So I'm probably feeding the neighbourhood because I've been open feeding. So, but I'm happy with that.
Yeah.
Can I ask, Terry, what prompted you to want to feed them so much at this point in time? Where's your location? You're on the East Coast somewhere?
No, I'm in country New South Wales in Young.
Okay, so you've got an idea of that environment at the moment. It's not conducive for bee feed. You've got, what's the stores on your bees? Is that something that's prompting you to feed them like that?
I'm pretty much just going on what a commercial beekeeper here has been doing with his bees. So I just pretty much guided with what he's doing, and I'll do the same. And he pretty much said, like, he's 5th generation beekeeper, and he said if they're taking it, then they need it. So that's why I just keep feeding them, and it takes them about 4 or 5 hours, and I put it in a kitty litter tray, and they've been taking the lot in 4 or 5 hours.
Okay.
It's a clean kitty litter tray, isn't it?
Oh, well, I hope so.
Yeah.
Extra minerals.
Yeah.
Yeah, protein.
Did anyone here see ABC Landline on Sunday? That was showcasing a fellow by the name of Rex Carruthers here in Queensland. He's actually been taking bees to almonds for the last 14 years, and he's got his feeding down pretty pat as far as getting bees up to strength so that they'll do the almond pollination the best way possible. What he actually does is he's lining up to take 2,000 hives to almond pollination this August coming. So what he's doing is he is open feeding sugar syrup at around about 27 to 30% solution. How he's doing that is he's putting 300 kilos of sugar into an IBC and filling that up with water and obviously dissolving the sugar. What he tells me, I had a good conversation with him on Monday night, is that the bees are gathering this sugar syrup and they are maintaining their brood area of 4 frames of brood. He's feeding them on a daily basis, and it's working out at 600 mils per hive per day that they are gathering for their daily requirements. His bees are on adequate pollen, but he also has pollen supplement available for the bees to pick up and gather. And yeah, one of the things about Rex's operation is that the last season he had an audit done, and basically what came back was that There are other people that had bees as good as what he had, but nowhere near as consistent. So commercially, for someone who's doing this large scale, he's got his feeding regime down fairly finely tuned.
Okay, so that would probably be available on iView if anybody was wanting to see that. And just like I said before, have a look at it if you want some revision or you want to contact Madlen anymore with a million questions, which we have. Have a look at that YouTube of Madlen. You don't actually get to see much of Madlen, but you know you can hear that WA. You can hear that WA accent very clearly, so that's the helpful info. I'm conscious. I am. Yes. Oh no. Definitely. Yes. No. There's not a chance. I'm just gonna. This is going to be. What do they call it in Parliament? I'm gonna just
don't be nasty.
Keep talking and.
I just want to ask, with that open feeding, because we don't feed bees much. With that open feeding, if you're putting out an IBC of sugar syrup, you'd have to be very careful that there's no other beekeepers that may have disease within a fair big radius, because I would imagine that there'd be a fair chance of disease getting spread if you're open feeding bees and there's if there's hives within a 3K or 8K radius for that thing, but it could be a big disease factor.
Just on that, Tim, reading through Doug Somerville's article on feeding bees in the open, there is an extremely low risk, if any, of bees getting disease from that open feeding situation.
Yeah, and if you're feeding bees in an open situation, and there's a dead AFB hive, and those bees are robbing that dead AFB hive, Paul, there's a big chance that they can spread it with going and sucking a gut full of sugar.
Yeah, I think the key there, thanks to the key there is if it stimulates robbing, which hopefully it won't because they're satisfied with what's being put out for them. But we have to always be cautious, don't we? That's the last thing anybody wants is disease.
Yeah, all that I was quoting there was Doug Somerville's thing that he put in his his article, and he's actually put that in red in his article. So,
yeah, I back you up there, Paul. I did read that. I was a bit sceptical of the comment because I do think that there's a big chance of that crossover of disease in that instance. Yeah. But there's some other reports that suggest the likelihood of crossing over of bee diseases, even from flowered, one bee landing with disease and another bee landing on the same flower, that the risk is very minimal. But
I'm just saying,
you take that risk, I guess.
Another beekeeper with AFB hives, like, 3 or 4 Ks away from you, I think it'd be a very high risk that you could get disease transfer.
Yeah, especially if they've got the same conditions your bees have and they're not feeding and you are. So they're going to come
exactly right, yeah.
I understand your point, and both points really. I do have a question for anyone out there that is anybody actually using the government grants for feeding bees? Have they applied for any of the funding that's available to commercial beekeepers?
We're getting sugar in Queensland. So, we've had a sugar allocation. And so, yes, I am using that to feed bees. Been feeding bees for, I think it's about 12 months now.
Yeah, right.
So that's not good, but yeah, we shall see what happens this spring.
So is it a full rebate on the costs that you've got for that? Or is
it has, the funding has run out, but yes, it was.
Just about to say that.
Yeah. So I've got some info I wanted to share with you if you were a New South Wales beekeeper, that we do have an apiculture funding that's available if you've not seen any correspondence, if you're not a member of the AA and you may not see this information. You can actually apply for a grant of up to 50% of the cost of pollen substitutes, or sugar to maximum of $15 per hive. So I guess you're paying that fee and then you're showing that you've paid it and then you're reimbursed for that amount. So just in case you've not seen that, I will put a link to this page when we put the video recording up of our webinar, in case anyone hasn't viewed it, and if you're interested in potentially making an application to have some funding back, because everybody knows it's not cheap to do it financially, also time-wise. You sort of, if you can get some money back somewhere for keeping your colonies healthy and maintaining your business, I think you should be interested in getting that there. FYI.
Is that only for the bushfires, Bianca, or is it for drought-affected areas too?
I believe, let me just have a look. Sorry.
Just because all the correspondence that I've seen, it's only for directly related to bushfire-affected areas.
Yeah, there could be a catch there. There are some guidelines about it. I'll look into it. I'll update that info.
I think they are taking each case as an individual. Do you know what I mean? So put your case and see how you go would be my suggestion.
Geez, old Jonah's given that track to somebody on the bottom there.
Yeah, I don't think he's actually there.
Yeah, he's there. He's there. I've been talking to him on the phone because I got him to hook up. I got him to hook up. He said, "I got to go back to work." I said, "Well, just watch it while you're working." But obviously, he's doing a great job.
We all owe him a little contribution for the farm tour we've just been taken on.
Yes.
Diesel rebate.
I think that might be on a rest stop somewhere. So anyway, I think that's just about our time, isn't it? In fairness to all and sundry. I don't know. Is there any other final question or comment? Madlen, what time is it there? It's about what, 9, 10 o'clock?
Yes, it's 9 a.m. now.
All right, yeah. Go and give yourself a cup of coffee, eh?
I've already been secretly drinking.
No, it wasn't secretly. Why do you think I mentioned it?
Come on, she's still in the pajamas. Leave her alone. Still wiping the sleep out of her eyes.
Okay, well, look, everyone, as always, thank you so much for coming along to this. I'll be interested to hear from people. I didn't get to tune into the QBA webinar, but as a webinar fan and see, you know, getting adjusted to people in 2 dimensions, I'd like to hear what you thought if you did see it, but just send it as some kind of message or conversation. Do join us in discussions. This webinar will be edited and posted for your fun viewing. Yeah, that's what you do in your spare time. I mean, what the heck? Bianca reads Fat Bees, Skinny Bees as her nighttime reading. Good on you, Bianca.
Slept well. Slept really well.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. We're going to check out now and keep the discussion going. And Madlen will be checking in frequently for your questions on this webinar. So, and she's got more hours in her day than we do now. So, see you all later. Good to see you, Will. We'll catch up with you along the way, everyone. Get on canvas.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.